Let's turn now to Professor Robert Dingwall. He's a sociologist at Nottingham Trent University. He knows a thing or two about how you respond to pandemics. He's advised the government on pandemic response for many years. He sits on NERVTAG, that's the government advisory group on new and emerging respiratory virus threats. He's appearing today in a personal capacity. We're delighted to welcome him to Spectator TV. Professor Dingwall, is the government not right to be a bit cautious about coming out of lockdown so that we don't end up back in it or we don't meet the unknowns? What's your overall view of the strategy?
Well, I find it rather puzzling that the government has spent a great deal of money on purchasing vaccines, rolling vaccines out, that we have very clear evidence from the clinical trials and from the experience so far and from the published work from Israel about how extraordinarily successful the vaccines are at reducing deaths, reducing hospitalizations, and generally transitioning the infection to somewhere comparable with the other 30 or so respiratory viruses that have afflicted humanity since forever. And yet we don't quite believe it. The data are there, the data are baked in, the improvements are rapidly coming through the system. And yet we have this continual insistence on, well, things might go wrong, we should be doing this just in case, we cannot possibly be too cautious, without really taking account of all the collateral damage that's being done. Your slides just there pointed to the excess deaths from cancer, heart disease, other conditions. They pointed to the economic damage. There's all the damage that's been done to children and their education. We should really be attempting to move as fast as is reasonably practicable, rather than thinking, well, we must drag everything out until the very last person who wishes to be vaccinated has been vaccinated and has had another 2 or 3 weeks to acquire immunity and another 3 or 4 weeks until we've crunched all the data.
Do you have a view then on where the government could move more quickly out of lockdown and move more quickly towards at least a semblance of normality? What should it be doing, in your personal view, that it's not doing at the moment?
Well, I think we could be moving much faster once the first phase of the vaccination programme is completed, somewhere around in the second half of April. By that time, we've taken out 98% of the mortality risk, almost as much of the severe illness risk. There's a little bit more in the over 40s, the 40 to 50-year-olds, but that could be mopped up fairly quickly. So we're then saying, well, why would we lock up a low-risk population for the summer, rather than thinking about the maximum number of restrictions that we can remove early in May? You might say, well, it's only 6 or 8 weeks coming forward, but those 6 or 8 weeks are going to make a great difference to the economy. They're going to be an opportunity for the health service to get going on the catching up with the backlog of elective surgery at a time when business is getting quieter. There's a chance for the overstressed staff of the health service to get a little bit of space to relax and recover. And I really don't see the justification for postponing everything in way into the summer when there is obviously one runs small risks, but there are tolerable risks of moving much more quickly.
So what did you make of the SAGE warning, the famous SAGE advisory body to the government, with Neil Ferguson, probably the most famous member of it, on that, saying this week that if you ease too much before Easter, it could lead to 55,000 more deaths, they projected. What do you say when you see something like that?
Well, I think it's very hard to see where these numbers are coming from. The problem with models is always that they're only as good as the data that you put into them and the assumptions that you make to join that data up. And the modelling that we've seen so far It's made unrealistic assumptions about the uptake of the vaccination and the effectiveness of the vaccination, and the models haven't really been corrected to allow for that. It's made unrealistic assumptions about fatality rates, which have been falling with the improvements in treatments since last year. And you can play with the numbers, you can produce a reasonable worst case, but we tend not to hear what's the reasonable best case. And since we're heading down towards, maybe 100 deaths a day from COVID within the next couple of weeks, it's very hard to see where all those excess deaths are going to come from.
Do you see any sign in the government's announcements and in its deliberations that it could take this view that it begins down the path that it has already explained, but it looks and says, hey, this is actually going better than we thought. We could speed this up a bit. Is there any chance that could happen?
Well, I think there are certainly opportunities for that. I mean, if the lines on the graph continue in the same direction for another 2 or 3 weeks, I would imagine that some Conservative MPs will be asking very serious questions about whether they should vote for the renewal of some of the powers at the end of March. But I think the position is quite clear that the government will only move faster if there are people pushing them to do so. And the people pushing them to do so will be pushing against some very formidable obstacles in terms of the risk aversion of some ministers, the risk aversion of some scientists. And I think there's sort of sense that the political elite, the scientific elite, the country's elite have really been very comfortable. We could all work from home, we've got big houses and we've got gardens, and we're really disconnected from the lives of the people who are serving us, the people who are doing the deliveries, working in the shops, working in the food processing plants. And they deserve to have their lives thought about too, and what it would take for them to be released from the sort of confinement that we've imposed over the last year or so.
It's certainly true that those coming up with the confinement are not those who bear the brunt of that confinement. I think that's true in the political and the scientific elite and the media elite as well. They're all not bearing the brunt of it. My guess would be that the Prime Minister's instincts would be to listen to you rather than to other experts, but he's overcome by what I would call the precautionary principle, that as a politician, it's better he is overcautious than takes what might be seen as a bit of a gamble with the kind of advice you would give.
Well, I think it's one of the interesting things, Andrew, is that phrase precautionary principle has been used so incorrectly all the way through. I mean, when it was originally coined in the 1990s, I was doing work on this in connection with genetically modified crops. The precautionary principle says basically you don't do stuff unless you've got a very thorough appraisal of the potential harms as well as the potential benefits. And all the way through, we've really failed to give as much attention to the harms of policies as we have to the alleged benefits. So we've never really had this sort of balanced look at what is happening to society, to the economy, to the mental health of the people as a result of the various control measures. Now, in part that's because the whole SAGE network was set up with a single issue focus, stop COVID. And the people involved with it are not asked to consider the wider impact of their actions. And I think that has skewed the advice coming to government. It's meant that there's been perhaps less open debate than there should have been within the scientific community as much as within the political community. And that the result of that is this sort of drift towards, if the objective is curbing COVID at all costs, then in a sense all costs become justified. And what people like me, I suppose, are trained to do as sociologists is to put COVID into a context, to say that there's a societal pandemic here as well as a biomedical pandemic. And that societal pandemic looks a bit different, and it should point us towards a rather different approach to the policies, which has a more, perhaps a better balance between the intended and the unintended consequences.
It's what we in economics would call a full cost-benefit analysis of the whole policy. Professor, we'll leave it there. I know you've got to get away. You have a busy day. Well, thank you for putting your case so coherently and giving our viewers something to think about, different from what they're hearing from government. Professor Dingwall there. Thank you for being on Spectator TV.